Avast, me hearties! 'Tis time for a deep dive into the Sherlockian waters of high seas adventure. In 1880, Arthur Conan Doyle, a 20-year-old medical student, signed on as ship's surgeon on the whaler SS Hope for a 6-month cruise through the Arctic seas. While he needed the money to keep pursuing his medical studies, he also needed a taste of adventure. The Hope, shown here, was a fine ship for its time, specially constructed to withstand Arctic conditions. But at 45 feet long by 28 feet wide, about the same footprint as a modern suburban house, it must have been a tight fit for its 56-man crew. Fortunately, Doyle got on well with the captain and crew and threw himself into the life of whaling and sealing. He also threw himself into the freezing waters more than once, earning the nickname the Great Northern Diver because he fell in so often. Unfazed, he insisted on accompanying the crew on their sealing expeditions on the polar ice and their whale hunts in the small whaling boats. While he reveled in the excitement, he also developed a sense of sympathy for the creatures he was hunting, referring to the process as a murderous harvest. In spite of these misgivings, the Hope made it back to port with a fairly modest haul of whales, seals, and other Arctic fauna, and Doyle was able to add 50 pounds sterling to the family purse, letting him finish medical school. But more important than the money was the experience of life at sea that he would carry with him forever. Even with his medical diploma, Doyle didn't quite have the wherewithal to set himself up in a practice. He still needed to build up both experience and capital. In his autobiography, he claims, "It had always been my intention to take a voyage as ship's surgeon when I had taken my degree, as I could in this way see something of the world and at the same time earn a little of the money which I so badly needed if I were ever to start in practice for myself." Given Doyle's adventurous nature, the chance to see something of the world probably weighed more heavily than the need for money in his decision to head back to sea less than a year after his Arctic voyage. Regardless of the motive, in 1881, shortly after graduation, he found a berth on the SS Mayumba, a steel screw steamer carrying cargo and passengers along the western coast of Africa. The ship was substantially larger than the Hope and the voyage less hazardous and isolating, but Doyle apparently liked the tropics less than the Arctic. By the end of the trip, he had decided that it was time to give up his Wanderjahre and settle down to medical practice in earnest. After the Mayumba, although he took other sea voyages later in life, they were always as a passenger, never as crew. But if Doyle had left the sea never left Doyle. After a brief sojourn in Plymouth, he settled down in the seaside town of Portsmouth, where for the next 7 years he labored to establish both a medical practice and a literary career. Several years before Sherlock Holmes made his debut, Doyle published 2 stories that strongly captured the popular imagination. The Captain of the Pole Star, first published in 1883, clearly draws from his experiences on the Hope. The narrative is a fictional extract from the journal of a young medical student who is signed on as ship's surgeon on an Arctic whaler. Sound familiar? His description of being icebound could only have been written by someone who had experienced the Arctic firsthand. "My fears have been confirmed, and the thin strip of blue water has disappeared from the southward. Nothing but the great motionless ice fields around us with their weird hummocks and fantastic pinnacles. There is a deathly silence over their wide expanse which is horrible. No lapping of the waves now, no cries of seagulls or straining of sails, but one deep, universal silence." Wow. In this spooky environment, it's easy for both the crew and the reader to believe that the captain has been pursuing the ghost of his young wife and that she has lured him to his death on the ice. But John McAllister Ray, Doyle's alter ego medical student, still has a hard time acknowledging the supernatural, imploring his readers to remember that "I do not write from conjecture or hearsay, but that I, a sane and educated man, am describing accurately what actually occurred before my very eyes. My inferences are my own, but I shall be answerable for the facts." We're already hearing a preview of Sherlockian rationality. J. Habakkuk Jepson's statement, published in 1884, shows the influence of the Mayumba voyage. This story is a speculation on the fate of the Mary Celeste, a real-life sailing ship found mysteriously abandoned in 1872. Doyle's story reached such a wide audience that the fiction, including the name change to Marie Celeste, is more well known than the real story. In a convoluted and fairly preposterous plot, Dr. Jephson boards a ship that should be bound for Portugal, but that is hijacked to Africa by Septimus Goring, a formerly enslaved American who wants to establish a free black nation. The understandably embittered Goring has no qualms about murdering the ship's captain and crew, but Jephson survives just because he happens to possess a mysterious black stone that Goring's comrades recognize as belonging to a sacred idol from their homeland. I said it was convoluted and preposterous. There's a lot more going on than I have time to summarize, but the striking descriptions of the African terrain, the villages and their inhabitants must have been inspired by Doyle's time in West Africa with the Mayumba. A few years later, in 1887, Sherlock Holmes burst on the scene in A Study in Scarlet, and Doyle, for better or worse, would forever be identified with his greatest creation. Holmes was very much a creature of London and a seafarer only occasionally, and then only to get from here to there. But for a confirmed Londoner, Holmes encountered a surprising number of cases that had their origin on the ocean, whether recently or decades before. In the Gloria Scott, Holmes's very first case, the one that convinces him to become a detective, tragedy at sea takes an entire lifetime to become tragedy on land. James Armitage, sentenced to transportation for Australia for a minor crime of embezzlement, becomes caught up in a revolt by the convicts on the transport ship Gloria Scott. After a successful mutiny, he and a handful of others are set adrift by the leader of the convicts for refusing to commit cold-blooded murder. This turns out to be a stroke of luck, as the transport ship is blown up in a last battle, leaving only one survivor who is rescued by the men in Armitage's lifeboat. The fugitives make it to Australia, where Armitage changes his name, makes his fortune in the goldfields, returns to England as a rich and respectable colonial, and lives a long, productive, unblemished life. Meanwhile, the Gloria Scott is recorded as lost at sea, like so many ships that simply vanished in the limitless ocean. But decades later, a blackmailer brings the truth to light. Ironically, the fugitive Armitage, rescued from the wreckage, returns to extort money in exchange for silence about the fate of the ship. Even a lifetime of virtue on land can't protect Armitage from a reckoning for his early crimes, and the shock and fear of exposure drive him to his death of stroke. In The Adventure of Black Peter, Captain Peter Carey of the Sea Unicorn has been living ashore for over a decade, but his character has not been improved by land life. He is as violent and abusive to his family and neighbors as he was to his crew when afloat. He has built a replica of his shipboard cabin on his estate, and one night he is discovered transfixed to the cabin wall with the very harpoon displayed so proudly on that wall. No one in the neighborhood is sorry to hear of his gruesome demise, but justice must be done, and Holmes is called in to investigate the crime. He untangles a blackmail plot by a former shipmate who saw Carey murder a shipwrecked man in the black of night so he could steal the man's valuable securities. After a dozen years, Black Peter has finally faced the consequences of his crime. Happily, not everything that happens at sea involves crime. In The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, the valiant Captain Crocker falls in love with passenger Mary Fraser on a voyage from Australia to England. While she likes him, she does not yet return his love, and once in England marries a rich nobleman, Sir Eustace Brackenstall. Unfortunately, her new husband turns out to be a violent, abusive drunkard, as Crocker discovers when on leave from another voyage. He ends up killing Brackenstall while defending Mary, then concocts an elaborate ruse to explain the death. Of course, Holmes quickly unravels the plot and tests Crocker by giving him the option to escape England. Crocker shows his true colors by refusing to leave Mary under suspicion of murder. Satisfied of Crocker's character, Holmes and Watson, as judge and jury, acquit Crocker of murder, assure him that Mary is in no danger, and suggest that he return in a year, expecting that he and Mary will have a future together after all. Shipwreck, mutiny, murder, and occasionally romance haunt the seas in many of Holmes's cases, but one thing that never appears is piracy. The only story that even mentions the concept is The Engineer's Thumb, in which Holmes compares the villain to those out-and-out pirates who will leave no survivor from a captured ship. By the time Holmes was consulting in London, the golden age of piracy had been over for a century and a half. The early 1700s saw truly terrifying marauders like Captain Kidd and Edward Blackbeard Teach causing serious mayhem for merchant shipping. They more than earned their reputation for leaving no survivors. But by the 19th century, piracy, while not wiped out, had been reduced to more of an inconvenience than a terror. However, as the reference in The Engineer's Thumb suggests, pirates still loomed large in the Victorian imagination. But they had become less the stuff of nightmares and more fodder for entertainment. In 1880, the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company presented the London debut of Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance. The operetta was wildly popular and has remained so ever since. The pirates would be unrecognizable to Blackbeard, coming across as both soft-hearted and extremely silly. Frederick, the hero, seen here being menaced by some very non-scary-looking pirates, was mistakenly apprenticed in his youth to a pirate instead of a pilot. When he discovers that due to his having been born in a leap year, his apprenticeship will not end until he is in his 60s, he must decide between his duty to the pirates, to his country, and to his heart. In their usual topsy-turvy fashion, Gilbert and Sullivan used piracy to skewer the Victorian conventions of social class, honor, and romantic love. Shortly thereafter, 1881 and 1882 saw the serialized publication of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Originally intended as an adventure story for boys, it has remained popular with all ages and both sexes. Many of our current notions of pirate paraphernalia, the wooden leg, the parrot on the shoulder, the eye patch, the treasure maps to tropical islands, can be traced to Stevenson's novel. His pirates were more criminally threatening and less goofy than the Penzance crew, but the bloodthirstiness was still toned down a little bit for the sensibilities of young readers. Given the Victorian interest in pirates, it would be surprising if Doyle didn't try his hand at the genre. And he did. Among his many non-Sherlockian sea stories is a series of 4 yarns about Captain Sharkey, a fictitious Golden Age pirate who amply demonstrates the worst character and behavior of the real 18th century pirates. The stories revel in torture, murder, plunder, and cruelty for its own sake. Their tone is substantially darker than that of most of the Holmes canon. Interestingly, the Sharkey stories began appearing in 1897, 4 years after Doyle tried to kill off Holmes at the Reichenbach Falls. Not an ocean, but still a watery grave. Did Doyle conceive of Captain Sharkey as a sort of seagoing alter ego of Holmes, if Holmes had gone completely to the bad? There are some interesting similarities. Sharkey's cabin aboard his ship, the Happy Delivery, could almost be seen as a dark parody of the sitting room at 221B. Doyle describes it as presenting a strange medley of luxury and disorder. The paneling of carved and polished sandalwood was blotched with foul smudges and chipped with bullet marks fired in some drunken revelry. A rich, soft carpet covered the floor, but it was mottled with wine stains and charred with burned tobacco. Although the bullet holes probably didn't spell out VR, the smudges, stains, clutter, and tobacco debris would have been right at home in Baker Street. Sharkey and Holmes share a lot of physical characteristics, too. Sharkey has a clean-shaven face, corpse-like in its pallor, a high, bald forehead, a long, thin, high-nostriled nose. Sound familiar? In addition to his physical presence, Sharkey also possesses the kind of cunning that lets him repeatedly get the better of honest sea captains. He is such a master of disguise that he once fools an entire crew into thinking he is the governor of the island of St. Kitts. Where Sharkey diverges from Holmes is in his complete ruthlessness and amorality. While Holmes sometimes skirted the law, he always did it in the pursuit of a higher form of justice. Although he once remarked that he could have been a great criminal if he had wanted to, I just don't think he had it in him. In contrast, Sharkey plunges elbow deep into butchery and murder for the sheer joy of doing evil. If Holmes had a repressed dark side and Doyle let it come out in Sharkey, it came out with a vengeance. Happily for us, Doyle brought Holmes back from the brink of the Reichenbach Falls in 1903 and sent him on another 20-plus years of adventures. And yet none of those adventures, even the ones like Black Peter and Abbey Grange that are based on occurrences in sea, feature Holmes and Watson actually doing their investigating on board a ship. Okay, they do commandeer a small boat for a chase down the Thames in the Sign of Four, but that's just not the same. Why did Doyle, who wrote so movingly about the sea, never set a Holmes story aboard ship? Perhaps he was reluctant to place Holmes, about whom he had such mixed feelings, in the midst of settings that affected him so powerfully in his youth. Even so, I would love to see Holmes and Watson in the closed world of a transatlantic steamer in mid-ocean, tracking down clues, making deductions, and apprehending the villain, far from the support of Scotland Yard or any local constabulary. Holmes would have a fresh set of challenges working so far from London, and Watson's trusty medicinal brandy would make a refreshing change from the traditional shipboard libation of rum. At least we Sherlockians can still have fun imagining our own versions of Holmes and Watson at sea, stalking the bad guys in open water on a Victorian steamer as it sails into a never-ending sunset.